Elias Mercer, a reclusive Wyoming rancher, hears newborn cries in a snowstorm, far from any homestead. The sound doesn't belong here, not in the teeth of a January gale that howls through the Bighorn Mountains like a wounded animal. Snow drives sideways in blinding sheets, piling in drifts that swallow fence posts whole. The air sits heavy at 20 below, the wind tearing at him with 40-mile-an-hour gusts, and somewhere far off, so faint it could be imagined, comes the scent of pine pitch burning. At first, Elias thinks the cries are tricks of the storm, the high, keening whistle of wind threading through the spruce. But then it comes again, sharper, closer. Not one voice, but several, rising and falling in an uneven chorus. His gelding stamps uneasily, head tossing against the reins. Elias reins in, listening hard, then swings down, boots sinking deep into snow that crunches under his weight. He leads the horse off the trail, following the sound through a stand of black-barked trees. The cries cut through the wind now, thin but urgent, drawing him toward a sagging fence post half buried in snow. The wood is split and weathered, ice clinging to the wire twisted around it. That's when he sees her, a young woman barely upright, lashed to the post with barbed wire that has bitten so deep it's drawn blood. Her arms are bound behind her, wrists raw and torn. Snow clings to her hair in frozen strands, and bruises bloom across her cheekbones, vivid against skin gone almost the color of the snow itself. At her feet lie 3 tiny bundles, swaddled in torn cloth. One is silent, unmoving. Another lets out a faint whimper. The third gives a thin, wavering cry, the sound that led him here. Elias kneels, breath clouding in the frigid air, and checks them quickly. Their skin is cold, too cold. The kind of chill that sinks into the bone. The woman's cracked lips part. Her voice comes as little more than a whisper, carried off by the wind before it fully forms. "Don't let them take my girls." He doesn't ask who they are, that can wait. With a flick of his knife, he slices through the wire, catching her as she collapses into him, her weight heavy with exhaustion and cold. He gathers the infants, tucking them into his coat, their small bodies barely stirring. The wind screams across the ridge again, and Elias turns toward the trail, holding all 4 lives against his chest as he starts the long climb back. If you love tales of grit, redemption, and love that lasts, subscribe to Dust and Destiny now and ride with us to the very end. The climb back to the cabin was slow and punishing, every step uphill through snow that clung to his boots and dragged at his legs. Elias kept his head low, shielding the woman and the bundled infants from the worst of the wind with his coat and body. The trail was narrow, barely more than a cut along the ridge, and the gelding followed behind, head down, steam curling from its nostrils. He didn't stop to rest. Stopping meant cold, and cold was the enemy now. By the time they reached the squat outline of the cabin, the sky had darkened to the color of lead, snow still spinning in a relentless curtain. Elias shouldered the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside with his burdens. The space was nothing fancy, 4 timber walls, a plank floor, and a sloped roof groaning under the snow's weight. But it was dry, and once a fire was going, it would be warm. He laid the woman gently on a pile of wool blankets in the corner, near the stone hearth. The infants came next, set in a basket lined with rabbit pelts. They were quiet now, which worried him more than their earlier cries. Dropping his gloves onto the table, Elias knelt at the hearth, stacking kindling with quick, practiced hands. The first strike of flint sparked, caught, and the smell of wood smoke filled the cabin, rich and sharp. He crossed to the shelves near the back wall, pulling down a jug of goat's milk and a small tin bowl. From his workbench, he took a spoon he'd carved months ago, the handle worn smooth by his hand. Setting the milk near the fire, he crouched beside the basket and checked each child again. Tiny breaths, slow but steady. That was something. When the milk had warmed, he fed them one by one, tilting the spoon carefully so no drop was wasted. The smallest girl took it weakly at first, then with more eagerness. The second sputtered but swallowed. The third, silent since the trail, managed a few mouthfuls before drifting back into an uneasy sleep. Only when the babies were wrapped tight and their color had improved did he turn his attention back to the woman. Her face was still pale, lips cracked from cold and thirst. He eased her upright just enough to get a few sips of warm water past her lips, then lowered her again, tucking an elk hide over her body until only her face was visible. She stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering open for a moment. He thought she might speak, but no words came, only a slow blink, as if her mind was struggling to place itself back in the world. Elias rested a hand lightly on her shoulder, his voice steady and low, carrying the quiet certainty of a man used to being obeyed by weather, cattle, and men alike. "You're safe here," he said. "On my land." There was no need for questions now about who she was, where she'd come from, or who had left her to die. None of that would matter if she didn't make it through the night. And Elias Mercer wasn't about to lose anyone who'd made it this far, not if he could help it. Outside, the wind kept up its assault, rattling the shutters and driving snow against the walls. Inside, the firelight spread slowly, chasing shadows into the corners. Elias fed the flames another log, then sat beside the basket, one calloused hand resting on the edge as if to remind the little ones and himself that they were no longer alone. Tomorrow, there would be time for names. Tonight, there was only the fire, the quiet breathing of 4 lives on the mend, and the unspoken promise that nothing, not cold, not hunger, not whoever they were, would cross this threshold without going through him first. By the second week, the worst of the frostbite had faded from her cheeks, and Clara could move about the cabin without swaying. The mornings had fallen into a quiet rhythm. Elias would be outside before sunrise, the thud of his axe against the chopping block carrying through the still air. Inside, Clara would sit near the fire with the girls, mending what she could, one of his old quilts now spread across her lap, the faded calico squares worn thin from years of use. She sewed with small, neat stitches, her fingers stiff from the lingering chill but steady nonetheless. When Elias came in for a midday meal, the smell of fresh coffee trailed in with him, filling the cabin with its dark, grounding scent. Clara froze at the aroma, the needle pausing mid-stitch. It carried her backward in time, before the bruises, before the cold fear that had become her daily companion. She was 17 again, sitting on her father's porch in the pale light of a Wyoming morning, steam curling up from a mug between her hands. Back then, life had been a stretch of open sky and untapped dreams. That year, she'd married Henry Holt, the wealthiest rancher in the county. Her father had called it a blessing, a fine match for a rancher's daughter. And at first, she'd believed it too. The Holt homestead was larger than any place she'd ever seen, with tall windows, a parlor rug imported from Boston, and servants who bowed their heads when she passed. The change had come quietly, almost politely at first. The birth of their first daughter brought only a cool frown from Henry. When the second girl arrived, he stopped looking at her altogether. By the time their third child was born, a small, squalling bundle he refused to even hold, his contempt had hardened into something darker. The night he told her she'd failed him, his brothers had been there, their faces unreadable as they carried out his verdict. She remembered the blows, the taste of blood in her mouth, and then the cold, how the snow bit into her skin as they bound her to the fence post. Henry had called it justice, said if the mountain took her, it was God's will. The last thing she'd heard before the wind swallowed the world was his boots crunching away through the snow. A shift in the light brought her back to the present. Elias stood in the doorway, setting a bucket of split logs beside the hearth. His face was unreadable, as it often was, but his eyes moved briefly over her work, then to the girls sleeping in their basket. Later that afternoon, she stepped outside to shake the quilt free of loose threads. Elias was working near the corral, repairing a section of fence. The air was crisp, the snow underfoot creaking with each step. Watching him, she realized there was something familiar in the way he carried himself. Steady, unhurried, as if the mountain answered to him alone. And then it came to her, sudden and clear. Years ago at the county fair, she had tripped carrying a bucket of water for her father's horse. A stranger, broad-shouldered, hat tipped low, had caught the bucket before it spilled and handed it back without a word. She hadn't thought of it in years, but now, seeing Elias's quiet manner, The memory fit. She held the thought close, not ready to speak it aloud. Instead, when he passed by on his way back to the cabin, she met his eyes and gave a small nod. He returned it, the faintest curl at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell her that here, in this high country cabin with the wind at the door, she was no longer invisible. The silence between them wasn't the cold, cutting kind she'd known before. It was the kind a person could rest in, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt the beginnings of something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Trust. It was late afternoon when the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters and whispering through the gaps in the cabin's timbers. Elias had just come in from hauling water from the creek, his shoulders dusted with snow, when he noticed Clara by the hearth. She was feeding the girls one at a time, her movements careful and unhurried, but there was a stillness in her face that told him something had shifted. When the last child had been settled back into the basket, Clara reached for the wool scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. Her fingers lingered there for a moment, gripping the fabric as if deciding whether to go on. Then she unwound it slowly and let it fall into her lap. The firelight caught the pale line that ran from just below her ear to the point of her chin, a scar that had softened over time but still bore the shape of a blade. Elias didn't speak, didn't look away, just waited. "It wasn't the cold that almost took me," she said, her voice low but steady. "It was him, Henry." She drew in a slow breath, eyes fixed on the flames. "After the third girl was born, he told me I was cursed, said I'd failed him. That night, they beat me until I couldn't stand. His brothers held me down while he told me he was doing me a kindness, giving me a chance to die in the Lord's sight. Then they tied me to that post and left me there for the snow to finish." Her tone carried no tremor now, only the flat, matter-of-fact cadence of someone who had lived long enough with pain to name it plainly. "The scar came before that night. First time he decided to teach me what happened to women who didn't listen." Elias's jaw worked once, but he said nothing. He didn't ask why she stayed, or how long she endured. He knew the answers wouldn't change what had happened. Clara went on, her eyes flicking to the sleeping girls. "He told me no man in this territory would want a woman who couldn't give him a son, that my daughters were mouths to feed and nothing more. Maybe he was right about the men he knew." Elias set down the cup he'd been holding and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Your girls," he said, his voice as even and unshaken as the ground underfoot, "are worth more than any man who can't see them." Her gaze met his then, and for a heartbeat neither of them looked away. The fire popped, sending a brief spray of sparks up the chimney. Clara's breath caught, and for the first time since she'd come to the cabin, she let her shoulders ease, as if some invisible weight had been shifted from her back. Outside, the snow kept falling in slow, deliberate flakes, covering the ridge in a clean, unbroken sheet. Inside, the air was warm, scented with coffee and wood smoke. Elias poured 2 cups, setting one on the small table beside her. They drank in silence, the kind that held no judgment, no demand for more, the kind that simply was. Every so often, Clara's eyes would drift to the basket and the soft rise and fall of 3 tiny chests. When she looked back at Elias, she didn't see pity in his face, only a steady, quiet respect. And in that small, fire-lit space, with the storm whispering at the walls, she began to believe that perhaps this was what safety felt like, not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who would not turn away. The snow had begun to soften on the southern slopes, revealing dark veins of earth and the first stubborn shoots of grass. Days were still cold, but the bitter edge had eased, replaced by a pale sunlight that lingered longer on the ridge. Clara had taken to stepping outside in the afternoons, wrapping herself in a shawl and letting the girls nap in the patch of warm light that spilled through the cabin window. Elias would be somewhere nearby, mending tack, checking traps, or working at the bench he'd set up against the wall outside. One afternoon, she found him there with his coat shrugged off, the sleeves of his work shirt rolled past his elbows. His hands moved with the slow certainty of a man shaping something that mattered. In his left palm, a thin plank of cedar rested. In his right, the The small blade of a carving knife traced clean lines into the grain. Clara stood a while without speaking, listening to the scrape of steel against wood, the steady rhythm, almost like breathing. He didn't look up, but she knew he'd seen her. It wasn't until that evening, after the fire was built high and the girls were tucked in their basket, that she understood what he'd been making. Above their sleeping forms, 3 small plaques hung side by side on the log wall. Each was no longer than her hand, the edges sanded smooth, the cedar polished until it caught the glow of the flames. Into each, Elias had carved a name in neat, deliberate letters. Lillian, Rose, May. For a long moment, Clara didn't move. The sight rooted her where she stood. No one, no family, no friend, had ever carved her daughter's names into anything permanent. Until now, they'd existed only in her own memory and the fragile thread of her care. She stepped closer, tracing each letter with the tip of her finger, the cedar warm from the fire's heat. She felt Elias behind her before she heard him. His voice was low, the words simple but carrying a weight that settled deep in her chest. "Names deserve to be seen," he said. "So do the people they belong to." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away from the plaques. "Most men I've known wouldn't have remembered their names long enough to carve them." "I'm not most men," he replied. There was no pride in it, just fact. Clara let out a slow breath, the kind that feels like releasing something held too long. She turned then, meeting his eyes across the narrow space. There was no grand gesture, no sweeping promise, just that steady, grounding gaze, the same one that had met her in the snow and told her she was safe. When she lay down that night, the cedar scent still clung to her hands, and for the first time since she'd been bound to that post, she slept without dreaming of cold or fear. Above the girls, the plaques caught the faint light from the hearth, the names standing clear and certain against the shadows. It was a small thing, maybe, but in the quiet language of the mountains it was also a vow. So, the news came with the first real thaw of the season, carried on the boots of a trapper who stopped by the cabin for coffee and a place to warm his hands. He was a narrow-shouldered man with a red wool cap pulled low, his beard salted with snowmelt. Between sips, he glanced toward Clara and the girls, then back to Elias. "Word in town is Henry Holt's been talking loud," he said, "telling anyone who'll listen you're keeping his wife against her will. Says she's not right in the head. And them babies," he gave a small nod toward the basket by the hearth, "he's claiming they're his by law. Sent riders to fetch 'em." Clara's sewing needle stilled mid-stitch. She didn't speak, but her grip on the fabric tightened. Elias just nodded once, the kind of slow acknowledgement that meant the conversation wasn't over, just postponed. The trapper left soon after, but the air in the cabin felt different, thicker, charged with the knowledge that trouble had found a trail up the mountain. That afternoon, Elias went to work. He reinforced the cabin door with a second crossbar and patched the rear shutter with oak boards so thick a bullet would think twice. He moved sacks of flour, beans, and dried meat into the root cellar, along with extra blankets and a jug of water, in case they needed to hide below ground. Clara watched him from the table for a while before setting down her sewing. "Show me," she said. He glanced up from the rifle he was cleaning. "Show you what?" "How to use it," she replied, nodding toward the revolver hanging on the wall. For a long beat, Elias didn't move. Then he set the rifle aside and took down the pistol. "You ever fired one?" She shook her head. "Then we'll start with loading." They stepped out into the clearing behind the cabin, the air sharp with the smell of melting snow and wet earth. Elias showed her the weight of the revolver, how to check the cylinder, how to ease the hammer back with her thumb. Her hands were steady. When the first shot cracked across the ridge, echoing off the mountains, she flinched but didn't drop her aim. By the third, she no longer blinked at the recoil. "Good," Elias said, taking the pistol back. "If you point it, you mean it. No warning shots." 2 days later, the weather turned. A storm rolled in from the northwest, faster and heavier than the last. By nightfall, the wind was a constant roar, driving snow in hard, blinding sheets. Elias stood at the window, peering into the white swirl. Somewhere beyond it, faint but certain, came the muffled rhythm of hoofbeats. "They're here," he said. Clara was already bundling the girls, Lillian in one arm, Rose strapped against her chest, May wrapped close to her back beneath the heavy elk hide. Her eyes were clear, no trace of panic. Elias handed her the revolver, then pulled a small pouch from the shelf and shoved it into her satchel. "Dried meat, biscuits, and a flask. Follow the creek south till the rocks split. Stay low in the willows. Don't stop until you're at the sheriff's place." "What about you?" she asked. "I'll buy you the time." Outside, the wind cut like knives, the snow thick enough to erase footprints in minutes. Elias led her to the back door, his hand on her shoulder for one brief, firm squeeze. "Go now." She slipped into the storm and was gone. Elias turned back to the cabin, moving fast. He dragged a spare coat onto a broom handle and planted it near the southern trail, tucking an oil lamp behind a snowbank so it would throw a flickering shadow that looked like movement. He led his horse halfway down the trail, tied it to a tree, and lit a small fire just beyond the bend. Enough smoke to draw eyes, enough heat to make men believe someone was there. By the time he returned, the hoofbeats were close. He stood just inside the cabin door, breathing slow, the weight of his knife familiar against his hip. The knock, when it came, was hard enough to rattle the frame. Elias opened the door to find Henry Holt standing on the porch, snow crusting the brim of his hat. 2 armed men flanked him, their coats drawn tight, their eyes sharp in the firelight spilling from the cabin. Holt's smile was thin and cold. "Evening, Mercer," he said, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "You've got something that belongs to me." Elias stepped into the doorway, blocking the view inside. The storm howled behind Holt, but the real threat was in the way his gloved hand rested near the butt of his pistol. And that's when Elias realized this wasn't a retrieval, this was a reckoning. The wind whipped hard across the porch, carrying flecks of snow that stung the skin like grit. Holt stepped closer, his boots grinding against the planks, the brim of his hat shadowing eyes that gleamed with something meaner than the cold. "You've got no right to keep her," he said, his voice pitched low but sharp enough to cut through the storm. "She's my wife. Those girls are mine by blood. Step aside, Mercer, before this turns ugly." Elias didn't move. His hands hung loose at his sides, no weapon in sight. "She was never yours," he said evenly, "and neither are they." Holt's mouth curved into a sneer. "Last chance." His gloved hand slid to the pistol at his hip, the black iron catching a flash of firelight from the cabin behind Elias. The gun came free with a slow, deliberate draw, barrel lifting until it was aimed square at Elias's chest. The moment stretched thin, the storm around them roaring like a living thing. And then, over the howl of the wind, came the crunch of hooves and the glow of lantern light. Shapes emerged from the swirling snow. 3 riders, the lead figure straight-backed beneath a deputy's star that glinted in the lamplight. Sheriff Baird swung down from his horse before the others had even stopped moving. "That's far enough, Holt," the sheriff called, his voice carrying the weight of authority that didn't need to shout. 2 deputies flanked him, rifles already raised. Holt stiffened, gun still in hand. "This is my land, my wife." "Not anymore," Baird cut in. He turned his head slightly, and from behind the deputies, Clara stepped forward, her cloak whipped by the wind, the revolver Elias had given her holstered at her side. Snow clung to her hair, but her eyes were steady as they locked on Holt. "Tell them what you did," she said, her voice strong enough to reach every man on the porch. "Or I will." Holt opened his mouth, but Clara's words came first, pouring into the frozen air. She told them about the beatings, the nights without food, the way he'd called her cursed for giving him daughters. She spoke of the fence post, the barbed wire, the cold that had crept into her bones as he walked away. The sheriff didn't look surprised. He'd heard enough whispers over the years, but it was the murmured agreement from one of the deputies that broke Holt's stance. "I saw the bruises," the man said. "Back in town, she ain't lying." Baird stepped forward, his gloved hand outstretched. "Hand me the gun, Holt." For a heartbeat, it seemed Holt might raise it instead, but the eyes on him were too many, the truth in Clara's voice too sharp to dodge. Slowly, he lowered the pistol and set it on the porch rail. The deputies moved in, cuffing him and the 2 men with him. leading them back into the white churn of the storm. When the last hoofbeats faded into the distance, silence settled over the ridge, a deep, heavy stillness broken only by the faint creak of the cabin's timbers. Clara stepped up onto the porch, her breath misting in the cold. Elias met her gaze. There was no need for words. She had not run to hide, she had gone for help. And because of that, the threat that had shadowed them since the snowbound night of their meeting was gone. For now, the mountain belonged to the wind, the fire, and the people who had chosen to stand their ground upon it. Spring crept over the Bighorn Mountains with a slow, deliberate grace, as if it knew better than to rush after so long a winter. Snowmelt trickled down into the creeks, filling them with clear, cold water that carried the scent of pine and thawed earth. The ridge where Elias's cabin stood changed almost daily. Patches of moss gave way to tender shoots of grass, and the first wild violets pressed up between the stones near the porch. It was a season for building, for claiming space not just to survive, but to live. Elias started by adding to the east wall of the cabin, his axe and saw working from dawn to dusk. The new section made room for a larger hearth and a proper table big enough to seat guests, not just the two of them and the girls. Clara watched him from the garden plot they'd carved out of the rocky ground, sleeves rolled up as she loosened the soil for potatoes and carrots. She chose deep green for the shutters, like the pines that don't bow to winter, she'd said. And Elias painted them carefully, each brushstroke slow and even, the scent of fresh pigment mixing with the sharper tang of sawdust. The garden became hers in the same way the ridge belonged to him. She planted beans along the southern wall, squash in neat rows, herbs in small clay pots that could be brought inside when the nights turned cool. It was work that left her hands dirty and her back aching, but it was hers. Work that grew life instead of just holding it together. Elias tended the traps and hunted when the season allowed, bringing back deer, grouse, and once a wild turkey that had Clara smiling for days. Word began to spread down the trade routes. Men spoke in bunkhouses and by campfires of a place on the ridge where the door opened to anyone with an empty stomach and a need for rest. They called it the Hearth at Mercer Ridge, and soon travelers, trappers, ranch hands, timber haulers found their way up the narrow switchbacks to the cabin. Clara would ladle out steaming bowls of venison stew, set warm cornbread on the table, sometimes slip a traveler an extra biscuit for the road. Elias kept their horses fed and the water trough full, and though he didn't say much, his presence at the doorway made it clear that no harm would cross the threshold. On quieter days, Clara gathered children from the scattered homesteads nearby and taught them letters at a chalkboard Elias had built from old planks. Some walked 5 miles for those lessons, staying long after the writing had been wiped away just to hear her hum the lullabies she'd sung to her daughters in the darkest nights. The girls, Lillian, Rose, and May, toddled between her skirts and the garden rose, growing stronger with every season. It was one of those rare evenings when the chores were done early that Elias came to her with a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. They sat on the porch steps, the last light of day spilling gold over the ridge. The air was cool but soft, smelling of new grass and wood smoke from the hearth. Elias handed her the bundle without a word. Clara unwrapped it slowly, the paper crackling beneath her fingers. Inside lay a shawl, thick and warm, woven in a deep burgundy hue with dark thread embroidery curling along the edges. On one corner, stitched in careful, deliberate letters, were 3 names: Lillian, Rose, May. Beneath them, in bold capitals, was a single word: worthy. Her breath caught, and she ran her fingers over each letter as if to make sure they were real. No one had ever marked her children's names into anything meant to last. No one had ever spoken that word, worthy, about her without mockery or condition. She looked up, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You made this?" "For you," Elias said. "Because you are." The shawl settled over her shoulders like something more than cloth. It was a promise, one not spoken in the vows of preachers or bound in the ink of court papers, but sewn into the very fabric by the man sitting beside her. That night, the cabin was lit by the low, steady glow of the fire. The girls chased each other barefoot through the patch of grass in front of the porch, their laughter ringing against the mountainside. Inside, the hearth crackled, throwing shadows that danced along the walls and across the 3 cedar plaques above their bed. Clara stood in the doorway, the shawl around her shoulders, watching her daughters run free under a sky blushing into twilight. Elias came to stand beside her, his hands resting lightly on the railing. Neither of them spoke, because they didn't need to. The ridge, the fire, the laughter, they all said enough. The past hadn't vanished, but here, they chose how to carry it. If stories like this stir your soul, subscribe now, share it with a friend, and tell us your thoughts in the comments.